I knew somebody had been on my land before I even reached the barn. And I do not mean that in some dramatic, old man yelling at clouds kind of way. I mean the snow told on them. Snow has a funny habit of doing that out in northern Idaho, especially after a night cold enough to make your teeth hurt. It keeps records better than people do. That morning, the whole lower stretch of my property looked like somebody had dragged trouble across it with a truck and a bad idea. There were deep tire ruts cutting through the white crust where no vehicle had any business being, boot prints by the fence line, and one long smear of black dirt where the snow had been chewed up down to the ground. I remember standing there with my coffee still steaming in my hand, thinking, well, that is either the dumbest bear in Boundary County or somebody just made a decision they're going to regret. Then I saw the barn door hanging open. My name is Caleb Rull. I am 48 years old, former combat engineer. Now I make my living designing backup power systems for cabins, ranch, homes, and off-grid places where the power company sends you Christmas cards instead of reliable service. I have lived on that 5-acre piece of land outside Elk Ridge for almost 14 years, tucked up against a stand of fir trees with enough slope behind the house to make every delivery driver question his career choices. It is not fancy land, not the kind of place you see in glossy real estate ads with a smiling couple holding mugs on a porch. It is practical land, hard land, land that makes you earn every quiet morning it gives you. People from warmer places hear the word preparedness and they picture some wild-eyed guy stacking cans in a basement. But anybody who has lived through a real mountain winter knows better. When the road ices over, when the wind takes a power line down, when the nearest hardware store might as well be on the moon, preparation is not a hobby. It is how you keep your family safe. That barn was my system. My little fortress against everything winter could throw at us. Inside, before that morning, I had a 400-gallon propane reserve tied into an 11-kilowatt backup generator, enough to keep the house warm, keep the well pump alive, keep the lights on, and most important, keep my wife Rachel's refrigerated medication from spoiling if the grid went down for more than a few hours. I had sealed bins of food stores lined along the north wall, not doomsday nonsense. Just practical supplies, rotated every year, labeled by month. About $10,000 worth if you counted it honestly. Under the side lean-to, I had 2.5 cords of split tamarack stacked dry and tight, because if you have ever tried to split frozen wood in February, you know that regret has a sound. And it sounds like an axe bouncing off a log while your fingers go numb. But when I stepped into that barn, all that order was gone. The propane lines had been cut, not disconnected, cut. The mounting brackets were twisted out like somebody had pried the tank loose with a chain. Several bins were missing. Others were ripped open. Food packs scattered across the floor and crushed into the mud on the boot soles. A sack of rice had split open near the doorway. Little white grains spread across the boards like somebody had thrown a wedding for idiots. I just stood there for a second, taking it in. And there is this strange thing that happens when you are really angry. The kind of angry that gets past yelling. Everything gets quiet. Your body wants to move, but your brain says, no, not yet. Look first, remember first, because this is not random. That was when I saw the paper. It was stapled to the inside of the door, bright yellow, laminated, like someone had been proud of it. Violation. Notice. Unauthorized utility storage, non-conforming structure, issued by Raven Hollow Property Association. And right there at the bottom, in neat blue ink, was the signature of Beatrice Caldwell. I actually laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because sometimes your mind needs a second to catch up with the stupidity standing in front of you. Beatrice Caldwell had been president of the association for 2 years, which in her mind apparently made her part mayor, part judge, and part queen of the gravel roads. She lived 3 lots over in a house with black shutters, a heated driveway, and one of those little stone lions by the walkway that always looked embarrassed to be there. She drove a champagne-colored Range Rover that never had a speck of mud on it, which, in our area, is basically a confession that you do not actually go anywhere useful. Beatrice had this way of speaking where every sentence sounded polite until you listened to what she was really saying. The first time she came to my door, she had a clipboard hugged to her chest like it was body armor. She smiled at me and said, "Caleb, we have received concerns about the appearance of your lower barn." I said, "Concerns from who?" She gave me that tight little smile people use when they do not have an answer, but still want credit for having one. "Several residents." I said, "Several is not a number, Beatrice. Her smile froze right there, just for half a second, and that was the moment I knew she was not used to being questioned. After that, it became a slow drip, a letter about visual harmony, another about rural aesthetic standards, which sounded like something invented by a person who would never carry firewood in sleet. Then came the fines. First $200, then $500, then a warning about daily penalties if I did not remove unauthorized storage from association viewable land. I tried to be reasonable at first, because contrary to what my face suggests before coffee, I'm not looking for fights. I repainted the barn a darker color. I planted a row of young spruce along the access side. I even filled out their ridiculous improvement form, the one that asked me to describe the visual impact of a building that had been there since before half those houses had foundations. None of it mattered. Every time I moved an inch, Beatrice found another inch she wanted. Rachel saw it before I wanted to admit it. One night, she sat at the kitchen table sorting insurance paperwork while I stood by the window staring down toward the barn, and she said, "This is not about the barn anymore." I asked her what she meant, even though I already knew. She looked up at me and said, "She does not like that you do not need her permission." That landed harder than I expected, because Rachel has a way of saying the thing you've been avoiding and then going right back to her tea, like she did not just rearrange your whole understanding of the world. And she was right. Beatrice was not protecting the neighborhood. She was protecting the feeling of being in charge. The barn bothered her because it reminded her there were still parts of that hillside she could not decorate, approve, deny, or fine into obedience. So, standing there that morning, with cut lines at my feet and her notice on my door, I understood something very clearly. This was not enforcement. This was punishment. Somebody had come onto my property in the dark, damaged what they could not control, and left paperwork behind like a burglar with a committee title. The old me, or maybe just the dumber me, would have driven straight to Beatrice's house, pounded on that expensive front door, and asked her what kind of low-rent dictatorship she thought she was running. And I am not going to lie, part of me wanted to. I could almost feel the satisfaction of seeing that perfect little smile fall off her face. But then I looked at the boot prints in the snow, the cut propane line, the torn brackets, the spilled supplies, and I heard Rachel's voice in my head saying, "Do not hand them the version of you they already decided you are." So I set my coffee down on a fence post, pulled out my phone, and started taking pictures. Every angle, every footprint, every tire mark, every piece of damaged hardware. I measured the ruts, marked the distance from the service road, photographed the notice, the staple holes, the cut marks on the line, the scuffed boards where the tank had been dragged. I was cold, angry, and running on half a cup of coffee, but I was calm enough to know one thing. Beatrice Caldwell thought she had left me a warning. What she had actually left me was evidence. By the time I walked back into the house, Rachel was standing by the stove in her clinic scrubs, one hand wrapped around a mug, the other resting against her hip. And she had that look on her face that wives develop after enough years of watching their husbands pretend they are fine when they are absolutely not fine. She did not ask what happened right away. She just looked at my boots, the mud on my jeans, the way I was holding my phone like it had become evidence instead of a phone. And she said, "How bad is it?" I told her bad enough. She closed her eyes for a second, and that hurt more than the barn did, because Rachel is not dramatic. She does not waste fear. If she looks scared, it means there is a reason. I told her about the propane line, the missing bins, the notice, Beatrice's signature. She set her mug down very carefully, like if she moved too fast the whole kitchen might crack open. "Caleb," she said, "do not go over there." I almost smiled, because she knew me too well. I said, "I'm not going over there." She looked at me like she was waiting for the second half of that sentence, so I gave it to her. "I'm going to the county records office." That made her blink. Honestly, it made me blink a little too, because 5 minutes earlier I had not known that was the plan. But as soon as I said it out loud, it felt right. Beatrice loved rules. Fine. We were going to find out whose rules actually mattered. The Boundary County Records building sat downtown in a squat brick office that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed excitement was a structural defect. Inside, it smelled like toner, old carpet, and the kind of government patience that can outlive everybody in the room. A clerk named Marlene sat behind the counter, silver hair clipped back, glasses on a chain. No nonsense in her face whatsoever. I told her I needed the original subdivision plat for Raven Hollow, including amendments, easements, and any special use designations tied to my parcel. She looked me over, from my work jacket to the folder under my arm, and said, "Association trouble." I said, "What gave it away?" She gave me the tiniest smile. Men do not come in asking for plat amendments on a Wednesday morning because life is going smoothly. I liked her immediately. She took me back to a records room with metal shelves and rolled survey maps in long cardboard tubes, the kind of place where every property dispute in the county seemed to be sleeping in alphabetical order. Raven Hollow had been filed in phases back in the late 80s and early 90s, back when the whole hillside was still mostly timberland, before people started building vacation homes and calling themselves rustic because they owned a cast-iron skillet. Marlene pulled out binders, maps, drainage notes, original covenanters, revised covenances, and one coffee-stained folder that looked like it had survived a flood, a divorce, and at least 3 budget cuts. I sat there for hours. I read language about access roads, water rights, utility corridors, setbacks, maintenance obligations, timber buffers, all the beautiful little boring details that people ignore until those details become a loaded gun on a table. At first, I found nothing useful. Raven Hollow had authority over exterior changes on residential lots. Yes, it could regulate visible debris, abandoned vehicles, fencing colors, some accessory structures. Beatrice had not invented everything. That was the annoying part. People like her rarely make up the whole rule. They take a rule that exists, stretch it until it screams, and then act offended when you notice. Around noon, Marlene came by with a paper cup of coffee so bad it almost counted as a misdemeanor. "Any luck?" she asked. I told her if boredom was a legal strategy, I was winning. She tapped one of the older binders with her finger and said, "Try the original land use reservations, not the association covenanters. Developers used to carve out odd little exceptions for utility operations before the homeowners ever got involved." That sentence changed everything. I went back through the first phase plat, slower this time, not looking for my street name or the association rules, but for the older county notes underneath them. And there it was, buried on a faded survey sheet with a handwritten reference number in the margin. Lot 7C, lower service bench, reserved for agricultural storage, emergency utility equipment, and fuel systems supporting rural residents, exempt from private aesthetic enforcement while actively maintained. I read it once, then again. Then I leaned back in that hard plastic chair and felt something inside me go very still. Lot 7C was my lower bench, my barn, my propane system, my so-called unauthorized utility storage. It had not just been allowed, it had been specifically protected before Raven Hollow Property Association had ever held its first meeting or printed its first threatening letter. I called Marlene over and asked if I was reading it right. She adjusted her glasses, leaned in, and gave a low whistle. "That is your lot." I nodded. She said, "Well, Mr. Rourke, I am not a lawyer, and around here that phrase keeps people employed. But if I were the association, I would not have touched that barn with a 10-foot pole. I asked for certified copies of everything. The plat note, the land use reservation, the county memo attached to it, even the old developer letter explaining why the lower benches were excluded from residential appearance control." Marlene stamped each page with the slow, deliberate satisfaction of a woman who had seen too many petty tyrants underestimate filing cabinets. When she handed me the packet, she said, "People think old paper is dead paper, but old paper bites." I carried that folder up like it had weight beyond the pages. Snow had started falling again, soft and lazy, the kind that makes the whole town look innocent, no matter what people are up to. I sat in my truck and called an attorney I had done some electrical consulting for a few years back, a guy named Daniel Mercer. Daniel had an office above a title company, wore boots with his suits, and had the calm voice of a man who had ruined plenty of afternoons without raising it. When he answered, I said, "Daniel, I think my property association just committed the dumbest act of authority cosplay in Idaho." He paused, then said, "I am listening." By 4 o'clock, I was in his office with photos spread across his desk, certified documents on top of the damage list, and my phone plugged into his monitor so he could see the close-ups. Daniel did not react much at first. He just clicked through the images. Propane line, cut lock, torn brackets, footprints. Notice Beatrice's signature. Then he opened the plat documents and went quiet in that attorney way that makes the room feel more expensive. Finally, he took off his glasses and said, "Caleb, they had no jurisdiction over that structure." I said, "That is what I thought." He shook his head. "No, I mean none. Not weak jurisdiction. Not questionable jurisdiction. None." Then he tapped the photo of the cut propane line, and this turns it from stupid into dangerous. Unauthorized entry, property damage, interference with emergency utility equipment, possible environmental and fire code issues depending on how that line was handled. I asked him what it meant in plain English. He leaned back and said, "In plain English, Beatrice Caldwell brought a clipboard to a lawsuit fight." I probably should not have laughed, but I did, just once, because after the morning I had, that sentence felt like medicine. Daniel got serious again fast. He told me not to contact Beatrice, not to respond to any association email, not to argue at a meeting, not to give them a single emotional sentence they could clip out and use against me. We would file a formal county complaint, notify the fire marshal because of the propane line, and send a preservation letter to the association demanding they keep all emails, texts, meeting minutes, contractor invoices, and security footage related to enforcement on my property. He said, "People get brave when they think a fire is private. They get nervous when they realize discovery exists." 2 days later, the letters went out. 3 days after that, the first call came from the county fire marshal's office. A man named Owen Pike asked if I was available for a site inspection. I told him I was available all day. He showed up with a deputy and a code officer, and the three of them walked the barn like men who had seen enough bad decisions to recognize one from a distance. Owen crouched near the cut propane line, looked at the dragged marks by the tank pad, then looked back at me and said, "Who authorized this?" I pointed to the yellow notice still stapled to the door. He read Beatrice's signature, and his mouth tightened in a way that said more than words. The deputy took pictures of his own. The code officer checked the certified plat copy, then the barn, then the plat again. Like maybe the paper would change if he stared hard enough. It did not. By the next afternoon, Beatrice knew. I did not hear it from her at first. I heard it from my neighbor Earl, who called me and said, "You might want to know there is a Range Rover driving around like it is looking for a place to explode." 10 minutes later, it came up my driveway, too fast for gravel, and stopped near the house. Beatrice got out wearing a wool coat, leather gloves, and the expression of someone who had arrived prepared to be offended. "Caleb," she said, "we need to resolve this before it becomes unnecessarily hostile." I stood on the porch with my hands in my jacket pockets and said, "Beatrice, somebody cut into my propane system and stole my supplies. I think hostile already got here before you did." Her nostrils flared, just a little. The association acted after repeated non-compliance. I nodded toward the barn. "On land you had no authority over." Her smile sharpened. "That is your interpretation." "No," I said. "That is the county plat, the land use reservation, and about 6 certified pages currently sitting on my lawyer's desk." That was the first time I saw the mask slip. Not all the way, but enough. Her eyes moved past me toward the barn, then back to my face, and in that tiny pause I could almost hear the gears stripping. She said, "You are making a mistake." I said, "Funny, the fire marshal said the same thing about whoever cut that line." She stepped closer, lowering her voice like we were suddenly sharing a secret. "Caleb, communities require cooperation." I said, "So does trespassing." Apparently, her face went red, then, not embarrassed red, angry red, the kind that rises from the neck. "You have always acted like the rules do not apply to you," she said, and there it was, finally. The truth without perfume on it. I looked at her for a long second and said, "No, Beatrice, I acted like your rules do not erase my rights." She did not have a comeback for that, and people like Beatrice hate silence when they are not the ones controlling it. She turned, walked back to a spotless Range Rover, and slammed the door hard enough to scare a crow out of the fir tree. I watched her reverse down the driveway, a little too fast, tires slipping once on the snow, and I knew, right then, she had understood the problem. She had not scared me into backing down. She had documented herself into a corner. The thing about people like Beatrice Caldwell is they do not panic right away, not where you can see it. At first, they perform calm. They send short emails with phrases like unfortunate misunderstanding and cooperative resolution. And they use words like framework and process because plain English would make the whole thing sound exactly as ugly as it was. Daniel forwarded me the first message from the association's attorney that Monday morning, and I remember reading it while standing in the kitchen, still in my coat, with Rachel packing her lunch at the counter. The email said Raven Hollow Property Association had acted in good faith based on ongoing safety and appearance concerns. Rachel looked over my shoulder and said, "Good faith is a funny name for cutting a propane line. That woman has never needed a microphone in her life." The county did not seem impressed either. Fire Marshal Owen Pike issued a written finding that the propane system had been tampered with by unauthorized parties. The sheriff's office opened a property damage and unlawful entry report, and the county planning office confirmed in writing that my lower service bench was outside the association's aesthetic enforcement authority. Once that letter landed, the whole temperature changed. Suddenly the same board members who had ignored my emails for months started remembering they had families, reputations, and home insurance policies that probably did not cover amateur midnight enforcement missions. The first crack came from a board member named Martin Sykes, a retired dentist with soft hands and a nervous laugh, the kind of man who could make eye contact with a molar easier than with another adult. He showed up at my place one evening just before dark, parked halfway down the driveway like he wanted plausible deniability, then walked up to the porch holding his knit cap in both hands. "Caleb," he said, "I need you to understand. We were told this was a standard compliance removal." I leaned against the porch rail and looked at him for a second. "Martin," I said, "when exactly did cutting locks and dragging fuel equipment become standard?" He swallowed hard and stared past me at the barn. "Beatrice said the contractor knew what he was doing." That one almost made me laugh, but not in a kind way. The contractor. There it was, the missing piece with work boots. I asked him who she hired, and Martin looked like he had just realized that telling the truth was cheaper than protecting a lie. "A guy named Roy Denton," he said, "Beatrice's cousin, I think. He does haul-offs, snow clearing, odd jobs." Daniel had that name within 10 minutes. By the next day, the sheriff's office had it too. Roy, as it turned out, had invoiced the association for nuisance storage removal, which might have sounded official if the invoice had not included 2 laborers, 1 flatbed trailer, 1 lock cut, and fuel equipment disposal. I am not kidding. He wrote lock cut on an invoice. I have met Labradors with better criminal instincts. Once that invoice surfaced, Beatrice's story started shedding parts like an old truck on a washboard road. She had claimed the board authorized a visual compliance action. The minutes showed no formal vote for entering my land. She claimed I had received final notice. Daniel asked for proof of delivery. There was none. She claimed the structure was abandoned. Owen's report noted active fuel lines, maintained storage, and current utility use. Every answer she gave created 2 more problems, and every problem had her signature somewhere near it. 2 weeks after the inspection, Raven Hollow called an emergency meeting at the little community lodge, which was really just a cedar building with bad acoustics and a coffee urn that had been burning the same flavor into people's mouths since 1998. Daniel told me not to speak unless he nodded. Rachel came with me, partly for support and partly, I think, because she wanted to see Beatrice try to act normal under fluorescent lighting. The room was packed. People who had never attended a meeting in their lives were suddenly very interested in governance. Beatrice sat at the front table in a cream sweater, hands folded, face composed, but she kept pressing her thumb into the side of her index finger, over and over. A tiny little tell that said the Queen had noticed the villagers carrying torches. The association attorney stood up and talked for 10 minutes without saying much of anything. Then Daniel stood, buttoned his jacket, and placed a folder on the table. He did not raise his voice. That was the best part. He simply walked them through the timeline. The land use exemption, the lack of authority, the cut lock, the propane tampering, the contractor invoice, the county findings, the sheriff's report, the estimated losses, the potential civil exposure. You could feel the room changing with every page. At first, people were curious, then uncomfortable, then angry, but not at me. A woman in the second row finally said, "Wait, our dues paid for this?" Nobody answered. Earl, my neighbor, leaned back in his chair and muttered loud enough for half the room to hear. Apparently, we got a monarchy and a demolition crew. That was the only time I almost lost my composure. Beatrice tried to speak after that, and I will give her this. She still had some fight left. She stood up and said, "We cannot allow individual owners to ignore community standards simply because they disagree with enforcement." Daniel looked at her and said, "Mrs. Issa Caldwell, my client did not disagree with enforcement. He disagreed with trespass. There was a silence after that, so clean you could have swept it into a bag. Then Rachel, very softly beside me, whispered, "Frame that." By the end of the week, Martin and 2 other board members had given statements distancing themselves from Beatrice's decision. Roy Denton, the cousin with the invoice and the tragic paperwork habits, admitted he had been told the association had full authority and that the owner had been notified. The county ordered proper inspection and repair of the propane pad, and the association's insurer got involved, which is when everybody stopped using phrases like neighborly resolution and started using numbers. The final settlement came about a month later, $72,000 total. It covered the damaged equipment, missing supplies, repairs, legal fees, inspection costs, and the extra work required to bring the new system up to a standard so boring and official that even Owen Pike seemed pleased. Raven Hollow also had to amend its governing documents to recognize the lower service bench exemptions on my property and 2 others nearby. That part mattered more to me than the money. If I'm being honest, money fixes a tank. Paper fixes a boundary. Beatrice resigned the same night the settlement was approved. No speech, no apology, just a short letter saying she was stepping away for personal reasons, which is a classy way of saying the consequences finally found the driveway. I never got my old barn back. Not really. I rebuilt it stronger. Steel doors, better lights, cameras on the corners, a new tank anchored into concrete. Everything labeled, documented, inspected, blessed by every clipboard that actually had authority. Rachel joked that the barn now had more legal protection than some small nations. But the first night after the work was finished, I walked down there alone. The snow was fresh again, clean and soft under the moon, and the new door shut behind me with a heavy sound that felt final. I stood there for a while, listening to the wind move through the firs, and I expected to feel victorious. I did not. Not exactly. I felt older. I felt grateful. I felt angry in a quieter way. Because winning does not erase the fact that someone thought they could cross a line on your land, damage what protected your family, and dress it up as community standards. I did not think Beatrice woke up every morning twirling an invisible villain moustache. People like that almost never see themselves that way. I think she believed order was whatever made her comfortable. And once you believe that, it becomes very easy to call control by prettier names. Maybe that is the part that stuck with me. A community needs rules, sure, but rules without humility turn into weapons, and the people holding them rarely notice when they stop protecting everyone and start protecting their own pride. So that is where I will leave it. If you were in my boots, would you have taken it as far as I did? County complaint, lawyers, public meeting, the whole uncomfortable mess. Or would you have rebuilt quietly and let peace cost you your pride? Was Beatrice a bully who finally got checked? Or did one bad decision spiral because everybody in that room let her power go unchallenged for too long? Drop your take in the comments, because I really do want to know where you draw the line between keeping the peace and standing your ground.